Okay, great. Thank you so much, Henry. So I am Ernesto Pastan. I'm going to chair this session today. Today we have 3 papers in 90 minutes. So each paper is going to take like half an hour. That'll be a hard deadline. So we will keep the time. But at the very end, I think that the session won't be closed down after the session is over. So if you want to remain in the session and have some colloquial chat about the papers, we will be here. If each paper has some time, well, you can ask your question during the half an hour. So we'll start with Isaac Hurtado. Isaac, could
Sí.
you share your slides, please?
I think that Guillermo is in the...
Or Guillermo, if you want to jump in first, as you wish.
By all means, Isaac, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And you already seen the presentation. It's okay. You see the presentation?
I see it.
Yes, we
Okay,
do.
thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Isaac Hurtado Rivera, and our working paper is named Productive Public Expenditure Multiplier in Colombia, and analysis based on SBAR model and DSG models. This is the outline of the paper. Okay, the government is an actor that exerts great influence on economic activity throughout the cycle of any economy, not only for its spending or revenue policies, but also in general if we consider an institutional point of view. Thus, carefully and informed study of both its behavior and the way in which this decision affect the other agents in the economy is justified. The literature on government expenditure offer a wide range of possible values of spending multiplier. Multiple factors the model used, the state of the economy, the type of spending, and the quality of the data can lead to different estimates. In the literature, we can find papers that estimate the multiplier in a value greater than 1, as per OT 2004, and Lozano and Rodriguez 2009. In the other hand, we have other papers that estimate the multiplier less than 1 or even negative. The most famous maybe is Blanchard and Perotti 1999, Boyciuk 2015, and Restrepo and Rincon 2006. The aim of this paper is to estimate the productive public spending multiplier in Colombia using a DSG model that explicitly incorporates a temporary shock to public investment and a SBAR model to contrast the results of the theoretical model. Most of the papers focus on the consumption spending, but we consider the investment expenditure. Our results suggest that the investment expenditure could have a positive effect on both on output, consumption, and employment by making more productive the other production factors. However, the multiplier obtained are not greater than 1, in line with the results of the conventional neoclassical models. We have 2 types of multipliers, the impact multiplier and the cumulative multiplier. The impact multiplier is the change in GDP given an exogenous change in government spending at the time it occurs. And the cumulative multiplier is defined as the effect on output since the public spending impulse is produced up to a period T. UR 2007 defined it as the sum of the multipliers brought to present value using the real interest rate of the sample considered. We can group the theoretical views of the effect of fiscal policy in two big streams, the Keynesian theory and the RBC's or neoclassical theory. The Keynesian theory is a demand-based view. It assumes that there is a excess in economic capacity. Prices and wages are inflexible in the short run, and we have multipliers greater than one. On the other hand, the neoclassical theory is based on the Ricardian equivalence principle, flexible prices and perfect competition. It recognizes the possibility that economies can self-stabilize through prices and quantity adjustments in the market. We have multipliers lower than one. Oh, okay. In literature, we can find very markable differences between multipliers in developed economies and emerging economies. Some reasons for this is that some papers find more permanent expenditure in developed economies than in developing economies. Also, the grade of openness of the economy, the debt level of the government, the degree of the development in financial sector, and the less idle capacity, especially in developing economies. Blanchard and Perotti were the first use a S-bar model in response to Ramey and Shapiro paper. Ramey and Shapiro said that the military expenditure has no relationship with macro variables or and this type of expenditure has is made it quickly. So it's a laboratory experiment, very at the perfect experiment for this type of shocks. Blanchard and Perotti do not agree with these assumptions. They say that in those countries where the war is held, where the war is taking place, the war affects infrastructure and capital. So they extend the analysis of unexpected shocks to an S-bar model, and they find multipliers close to one but below one in the first quarter. They also find conclusions with a Keynesian view. They find that the consumption increase when there is an unexpected government expenditure. Auerbach and Gorodnichenko, 2012, use a smooth transition bar. They say that in recession, there are the greater multipliers than in expansion phase, because it is less likely to have a crowding out effects in recession. In their work of 2013, they have similar results for OECD countries. They find that in recession, the multipliers are greater than one, but in expansion we have multipliers less than one and more close to zero. Baxter and King use a DSG model with government consumption and capital inutility function, and they also differentiate between permanent expenditure and temporary expenditure, finding that the permanent expenditure has a larger multiplier than a temporary expenditure. They also incorporate public capital in production function, finding that the multipliers could be much greater than one due to a crowding in effect in investment. In Colombia, we have papers like Lozano and Rodriguez, also using an S-bar model. They find multipliers of 1.12 and 1.19 between in the short and the long run, respectively. They also find that the investment expenditure has a larger multiplier than consumption multiplier, and they find that public expenditure could have a positive effect on private investment. Restrepo and Rincon use an S-bar and S-BEC models. They find a multiplier of 0.12. They think that is due to a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. Also, Gonzalez and others use a DSG model and a bar model to estimate the multipliers. They find multipliers in the DSG close to 1 and the bar in a range of 0.7 to 1.8. So this is our DSG model. It's a central planner model that should maximize this utility function. Subject to some restriction, we have that we had the law of capital accumulation with adjustment cost. We also consider a Cobb-Douglas for the production function with constant returns to scale and increasing labor progress. So we have in the Cobb-Douglas, we have private capital, public capital, and labor. We have also in the law of public accumulation, public capital accumulation, we have the shock that is next to the IG. So if we replace GT plus 1 in the production function and the next period, the stochastic shock works as a jump in the marginal productivity of public capital produced at T, as becomes visible in the next period, which in turn ends up raising output. We follow Greenwood and others in 1988. We also have adjustment cost in the law. From the equilibrium condition is obtained that the central planner will choose a capital combination until their marginal productivity is equal, as is in this equation below, at the same depreciation rate for both capitals. So an expected increase in public investment that generates an accumulation of the stock of public capital will initially bring about a fall in the stock of private capital and investment, because these are resources that the central planner allocates in one sector and bring it to another. In the convergence towards to the steady states, where the long run relationship, that is the equation below, there should be an increase in stock of private capital and investment, thanks to the fact that the government's capital stock make private capital more productive. So there is a greater demand for private factors, not only private capital, but also labor. And another consideration to take into account is the higher net marginal productivity of capital will imply a greater incentive to save, which may present consumption lower. In this case, we have two types of capital, so we have two Euler equations. So this is we could say the adjustment of the model with some ratio. We could say that the model fits very well to the real data, except in the investments. We think that is due to maybe we have an equal depreciation rate, and maybe in the real, actually, it is not like that. It could be they could have a different depreciation rate, or we use a higher um, deflator when we construct the series. And these are the parameters for the model. So this is the results of the public investment shock in the DSG. So we have effectively we have a boost in GDP. We have an increase in employment as the neoclassical theory expects. We have a crowding out effect on consumption and investment. In the case of the consumption, we have that the marginal productivity of private capital rise, so the agents have an incentive to save. So because the present consumption makes it more um, costly in terms of future consumption. So, but later the consumption rise above the steady state because there must be a compensation of for the saving. In the case of private investment, as we expect, we have a crowding out effect because the central planner allocates more resources to the public investment or to accumulate public capital. So the private investment have a crowding out effect. But if you see the impulse response for the private capital, you can see that it grows above the steady state because the public capital make it more productive. So there is a incentive to accumulate private capital. Now we have the S-bar model. We use a recursive form. The advantage to use the recursive form is that we should not impose exogenously the parameters, as is in the working paper of Blanchard and Perotti. The quality of the data and the variables include, and they ordered in the A0 matrix affect the results. We use quarterly data between 2005 and 2018, and the variables are expressed as logarithmic deviation for the train using the Hodrick and Prescott filter, and we report 68% confidence intervals as Blanchard and Perotti do. So this is the public investment shock in the S-bar model. We have an increase in GDP, but it's slightly, it is only significant in the first period, and between the period 10 and 13, and this is consistent with some literature that find that in developing countries, the public spending is delayed to affect the GDP. We have a labor demand increase that lead to an increase in consumption due to rising wages, and we have no conclusive effect on private investment. It is only significant at period number 10, but we cannot say that we have a crowding out effect or a crowding in effect or synergies between private sector and public sector. So the conclusions, we have impact multipliers for the S-bar of 0.83, and the DSG impact multiplier is 0.18, and the cumulative multipliers are 0 in the S-bar after a year, and also 0.5 in DSG. So the advantage of including government as an agent that provides capital is that it generates a different dynamic when it is considered a simple entity that excludes the private sector from resources but can generate a positive effect on them. We here I have some like a discussion that um, that look for an explanation of the differences between the multipliers. So in the economy, in the Keynesian benchmark, we have rigidities, we have inflexible prices versus flexible prices and perfect competition. So if we have more rigidities, the multiplier will be higher. And if we have more inflexible prices, the crowding out effect will be lower. Also, if we have rigidities in labor market, the multiplier will be lower because as Rami 2011 says, the success of the government spending lies on the ease in which it generates employment. Another assumption of the Keynesian theory is the idle capacity. It affects multipliers. It can be larger or, on the contrary, non-existent as in neoclassical model and as Ori 2016 says for emerging countries. We could say that there is a difficulty or a problem with the DSG models is that they not differentiate the phase of the cycle. So if the economy is below its potential, fiscal spending will have a greater impact on the economy. And also, if we consider the Ilsetsky and other criteria for closed economy, that is exports plus imports to GDP ratio, Colombia has a ratio around 40%. So the literature considers that a closed economy has a larger multiplier than an open economy. And that's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Isaac. So you have 5 minutes left. So if some of you want to ask questions or comments now, you can do it. Otherwise, we will respect the half-an-hour window for each paper, but at the very end, we will remain a little bit longer than the official session ends, in case that someone wants to jump in. So I have one question for Isaac.
Okay.
So this closed economy aspect may be important if you are intended to model the Colombian economy.
Yes.
Have you tried to expand the model to those?
Yeah, that's something that we are doing right now. This is like a benchmark or yeah. We are looking for expand to an open economy and maybe incorporate more rigidities. That's what we are thinking to do.
Okay. So one other comment I have is for benchmarking. I think it would be good that you could solve the model in the case in which government spending just has the usual role within the model.
Okay,
Not this.
like another benchmark.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
And that will help us to understand better what extra ingredients or what extra quantitative kick you're getting from the special channel through public investment.
Okay, thanks.
One question here. Isaac, very nice. Thank you very much. Just two thoughts, maybe I miss it because I'm not an expert on the theory front. When you talk about close and open, the discussion that Carlos Ilsetsky and company mostly push is the idea of open or closed to trade. Because if you have an open economy, you have all these leakages. You spend money and then the money goes out. But there is the other front, which is the closeness on the bonds front, on the financing front. And Bronner has a very nice paper where they show is basically if you finance your spending with external debt, then you don't have the typical crowding out that you would have in your economy. So I wonder if you have those tools to play around, because sometimes it's nice to show that it's good to be open, at least on the financial front.
Yeah. We think that in the open, we have two hypotheses about the open economy. One is that one that you said that in an open economy, the government can look for resources in other countries, we could say, and the other is the model Fleming result. The model Fleming result that we can have a increase in real terms. So the net exports could sterilize some of the government expenditure. So we could have like the two results of that. But the literature it's conclusive when the debt of the government is used. If the government has some restriction of if the debt level is very high, they have a more external constraint when they go to or they look for more resources for the economic for the fiscal policy. Okay, thanks.
So we have a couple of more minutes for comment or discussion. Otherwise, we'll move to Guillermo's paper. Okay, Guillermo, the screen is yours.
Okay.
Thank you, Isaac.
There we go. Sorry about this, I'm quite slow. There you go. Can you see this now? Excellent. So
Yes.
thank you very much. Let me see. Yes, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. So thank you so much. Thank you, Isaac. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Ernesto. So this is a paper that we have worked with half a soccer team, several colleagues from the office, Argentina, now Pedro, who is at the IMF. So this is a paper on social transfers, and a little bit like the paper from Ernesto, and the paper from Isaac, what we're looking is at some components of government expenditures. In this case, the transfer multipliers. And in particular, there is some evidence on the size of the social transfers multipliers in developed countries, but not that much on emerging markets. So what we're going to do here is two things. On one hand, show you some estimates on the size of the multipliers, but also tries to tackle these differences regarding the role of a hand-to-mouth consumer, which is a very well-known element in theoretical models of this type, and it's nice to show it in these two continents, so to speak, so two type of countries. Sorry. So this is a joint paper with Jessica Bracco, Luciana Galeano, Pedro Cuarros, Daniel Mesa. So sneak peek of the paper and our findings. As Isaac showed us, there is a large literature, especially in the last decade or so, on the size of spending multipliers. Most of the focus has been at the very beginning on the aggregate spending, the size of the aggregate spending multiplier. And as Isaac also shows, it's most of the papers firstly took a look at key macro frameworks, the fact that the multipliers are larger in recessions, larger when the exchange rate is fixed, are larger when the debt is low, because the Ricardian, the access to debt is critical on that front. Is higher when there is monetary policy is accommodative. Is higher when economies are less open to trade, and when spending is financed with government debt. Now, when thinking about what is going on, especially with the COVID, but also before that, a key ingredient of government expenditure is social transfers. It mainly includes unemployment benefits, family programs, and pensions, and they represent about 50% of primary spending, and it keeps growing. So it's not a teeny part of government expenditures. And what we do in this paper is to estimate the size of that social transfer multiplier, which is defined as the effect that the $1 change in social transfers has on aggregate level of GDP. What do we know about this? Well, we know on the empirical front, not much. There are few studies for developed countries and no evidence, at least on the aggregate front, for emerging markets. And even though in developed countries, different studies differ in their empirical strategy, what they find typically is that the social transfer multipliers are relatively low, somehow ranging between 0 and 1. And the consensus, even though there is not that much consensus on the size, on the mechanism, the consensus is that the effect, of course, mainly through consumption rather than via private investment. And on the theoretical front, typically what these papers do is they rely on different variants on closed economies to Asian neo-Keynesian models. And even though they are very, very interesting models and very large, we're going to take a look at those. Basically, you need to have two things in these models. The first one is two group of agents, ones that have access to capital markets, the Ricardian ones, and ones that do not have access to that, the hand-to-mouth, the liquidity constrained people, and those ones are the ones that we truly care about, because those ones are the ones that when we give the dollar, they spend a lot because they're financially constrained. And also, when taking a look at the transfers, what is very important is to what extent that transfer from the government actually reach those hands-to-mouth agents, which is another parameter that typically is calibrated in these models, is theta, which is the share of transfers reaching actually those hand-to-mouth agents. And if you take a look at what is going on, again, following what is out there, most of the papers have focused on advanced economies, and typically they have studied the role of persistence in the fiscal shock and the role of accommodative monetary policy. As far as we know, there is no study measuring the social transfer multiplier outside this developing group of countries, and no study has played around exploiting that heterogeneity in terms of the share of hand-to-mouth agents and the social transfers reaching out to those hand-to-mouth agents. Some papers that are related to ours, of course, is the issue of the paper by Kaplan, where they discipline this alpha, the share of hand-to-mouth people to the United States, 1/3. And typically the value theta is play around. Sometimes it's assumed to be equal to 1, meaning that all transfers actually reach the hand-to-mouth people, meaning perfect targeting through the eyes of, not of micro people, but through the eyes of macro people. They reach the ones that are liquidity constrained. And in other cases, they find this, they play around with this assumption of neutral targeting, meaning theta is equal to alpha, in the sense that money is thrown through a helicopter and it reaches equally the alpha and the Ricardian and the hand-to-mouth agents. So what is that we do, and what is that we find? We use a sample of 6 Latin American countries, 17 developing countries, using quarterly data on social transfers. And what we found is that the social transfers multiplier is larger on impact in Latin America than in developed countries. We find, in line with the theory, in line with the current evidence, that the main mechanism occurs through consumption as opposed to investment. So that's good. We are crazy, novel, but not that crazy. And we also find that the effect is very important in the short term, but it vanishes in the long term. And this is in line also with Isaac frameworks, in the sense that these transfers are not productive ones. They are not inside the production function. They are just transfers that reallocate money around people, but it actually doesn't change the TFP. So after finding this, what we do is we use a simple out-of-the-shelf calibrated tank model. We calibrate it with the typical parameters, especially the ones that we are pushing for, this alpha and theta, the share of people living hand to mouth, and the share of transfers reaching hand to mouth people. For that, we use a novel data that I'm going to show you. And what we find is a model that is able to mimic, to match these empirical results on these three fronts: on the size, on the mechanism, and on the temporal profile. Given that, and given that we find evidence that the share of hand to mouth people is higher in emerging markets than in developed countries, we suggest the idea that this might be more of a general result than just a lag result. So what is it we find? As I told you, we have this on the empirics front. We have 6 Latin American countries, 17 developed countries, quarterly data, going as much as the 60s, Blanchard methodology based on local projections. Here, the issue of endogeneity is a big deal, of course. So what we try to do here is to estimate first on a country basis the unanticipated component of social transfers, and for that we particularly exclude the unemployment insurance component because that is very reactive to business cycle considerations. It's difficult to think that unemployment insurance would be an exogenous shock, so we exclude that. We clean it up with this specification. We took from that specification 1 the error term, which would be, if you buy this strategy, the unanticipated component of that shock. And then we use, as in Ramirez-Subari, 2-stage approach where we use that shock as an instrument for social transfers, and then we see what is the impact of that social transfer on output. In particular, differentiating between, that's why in specification 3 you have a lag interaction term, using a dummy variable, trying to distinguish the social transfer you will get for lag and the social transfer you will get for developed countries. We also do a bunch of additional exercises that I will not show you, but we do a bunch of robustness stuff to see that this is more or less robust, and it is. And this is what we find. Talking about, remember these 3 facts. Fact number 1, we find that the social transfer multiplier is larger on impact in Latin America than in developed countries, about 3 times larger. It goes from 0.3 to 0.9. Still, as Isaac was saying, disappointingly below 1, but at least it's bigger. The second fact, in line with current theory and current empirical evidence, is that the effect comes through consumption, not through investment. And this, of course, both for lag countries, which are these reddish ones, and for advanced economies, which are the blue ones. So again, larger multipliers, and now fact 2, the effect comes through consumption, not through investment. And last but not least, we show that the effect is very important in the short and medium term. You see that that multiplier, especially for lag, is around almost 1 in the short term, but tends to vanish as time goes by. And this is very, very different from what you would get from public investment. We have a paper a couple of years ago, in MBR paper, that what we show is that the dynamics of public investment multiplier is precisely the opposite. Is that at the very beginning, it doesn't boost economic activity that much, but as all these synergies with the private sector starts to begin, it tends to increase. So social transfer doesn't seem to look like the spending you would use for long-term growth, at least from an empirical point of view. How about how to rationalize this fact through the eyes of some out-of-the-shelf type of model? Well, here, as I told you before, we use a closed economy to Asian nuke initial model. We took it from Stephen Pennis and Giambattista. He was very nice of sharing the code and everything. And I'm not going to explain the whole model, but basically, as I told you before, the key difference is that you would have 2 types of households: the Ricardian ones, which are the ones that can borrow and are taxed. And to some extent, this 1 minus alpha might receive some transfers. On the other hand, below in equations 8, 9, and 10, the hand-to-mouth households are financially constrained. That's why they don't have the ability to borrow or save. And they receive a theta share of their transfers. I'm not going to go into all details of the model. But what is the main idea here? Why is that alpha and theta are so important? Why is that the share of hand-to-mouth people and the ability to target those people with those transfers are very important? Well, on the share of hand-to-mouth people, which is this alpha, the higher is the share of people living hand-to-mouth, the higher is the people that are financially constrained, the higher is the people that if you give them $1, they will increase consumption by a larger margin. So that's why the higher is the share of alpha, the higher is the average marginal propensity to consume. If you throw a dollar somewhere in that economy, the higher is the alpha, the higher is the ability for that money to move around and to push for a persistent shock, if I may, a persistent response of that shock. And on the size of the alpha is related to who gets that first dollar. To the extent that you can increase the ability to reach some particular person, that is hand to mouth, the proportion of that dollar will be much more spent than if it gets to a Ricardian ones. And that's why this theta is so important. In the paper, we do a big deal about also differentiating this ability to reach hand-to-mouth people, this theta, between the people that, the prevalence of the hand-to-mouth people and the ability to target that people. In other words, you could get your money to get to the poor people not poor, sorry, not to the poor, to the hand-to-mouth population in your country. One, if there is a lot of people that are hand-to-mouth. Second one, if you are truly able to reach those hand-to-mouth people. And there is a difference in terms of what is the role of a state here. Because when you think about fiscal policy is more related to the ability to target those transfers as opposed to increasing or decreasing the share of hand-to-mouth, which is more related to financial developments type of stories. Crazy graph, I'm going to pass it fast. So I have been talking a lot about the empirics, the result we found, the theoretical model, which seems to be very reliant on this alpha and theta, but I haven't shown you where the hell we get some information about the share of hand-to-mouth people and the ability to reach those hand-to-mouth people. So in principle, when you take a look at what is going on out there with the data, there is a lot of data on advanced economies, especially looking at two types of strategies. One is the work by Kaplan and Violante, when what they look at is by the liquid net worth, and they work around with the wealthy hand-to-mouth and the not wealthy hand-to-mouth and so on and so forth. But the main idea is there is a significant share of people, even in developed countries, that are financially constrained, but not because they're poor, just because they're liquid constrained. Other type of studies, what they focus in is on self-assessed measures of one capacity to deal with a shock. So for example, Lusardi has a very nice series of papers where what he shows with other co-authors is the share of people that could not come up with a certain amount of money to deal with a shock. So for example, if you think about the United States, and when asked how many people in that survey could not face a $2,000 unexpected expense, about 22 to 28% of that people could not come up with that, which is more or less similar to the one coming from other type of strategies, like the one by Kaplan and Violante, with a different empirical strategy. And as I told you before, typically the theta, the ability to reach hand-to-mouth people, is actually assumed. It's not based on data. So what is that we do? We use the data that is out there, that has been out there for quite some time now, which is based on the World Bank's Global Financial Database, which particularly asks, much along the lines of Lusardi, to a lot of people in many, many countries, to what extent they could come up with 1/20th% of GDP per capita, which is basically around the $2,000 equivalent for the case of the United States. So it's a measure of how financially constrained people are. Again, not based on surveys of wealth, but rather on self-assessment. And we push in the paper that this is very important because in the developing world, a lot of people might rely on other strategies to deal with financial shocks other than just bank accounts. And in terms of how to reach, to what extent social transfer reach hand-to-mouth people, well, in that same data set, they ask people if they receive some social transfer, some pension, or some unemployment insurance from the government. So we can estimate very easily that alpha, that theta. What is that we get when we use that data? That on average, no surprise here, the share of hand-to-mouth people is higher in emerging markets, the red ones, than the blue ones, the developed countries, and that in LAC is particularly high. No surprise, LAC is quite financially constrained. In terms of theta, the ability of those transfers, fiscal transfers to reach hand-to-mouth people, they're also larger in LAC. And actually they are larger precisely because there is a lot of hand-to-mouth people. In other words, the ability to target, at least when looking at the whole bag of social transfers, is quite low. So given the empirics, given the theoretical framework that organizes our head in terms of the role of alpha and theta, and the evidence that I just showed you in terms of the size of alpha and theta, what we do next is calibrate this model and to see to what extent the calibrated model can help us to explain those sizes. So what we do here is to calibrate this tank model using parameters from the literature, and especially, this is our contribution, so to speak, put in the values of alpha and theta that come from this survey at the World Bank. And again, remember that alpha and theta are about 20-something% in developed countries and about 60% for LAC countries. And we try alternative calibrations, and the result seems to be quite robust on that front. And what is it we find? Well, here what we do is to contrast the data, the empirical results we got, with the actual calibrated results from the model. And what we find, more or less, I'm not an expert on this, but one of my co-authors this seems to be quite good in terms of matching the results. Again, on the blue ones, you have the developed countries, and on the red ones, you have Latin America. And they're quite well in matching the size, as I will discuss now, the size and the composition. On the size front, we tend to find also derived by the model that the multiplier is larger in LAC than in developed countries. And in terms of the composition, that the whole action seems to be coming from consumption as opposed to investment. Again, because based on the model, and it's good that it works, it seems that social transfers are not affecting anything regarding productivity, but rather the ability to people to consume, and at least in the very short term. And this relates to the third fact, that in the model also shows quite nicely that the effect is very important in the short term, but as time passes by, this tends to vanish over time. One last thing we do in the paper is to try to disentangle the difference between the social transfer multiplier in LAC in LAC and in advanced economies, driven by these different factors. And what we find is that a large difference is driven precisely by the higher share of hand-to-mouth people. And this ability to target doesn't explain that much. Of course, we play around with different specifications, but the results are quite robust. So, some final thoughts. What we have shown in this paper is new evidence on social transfer multipliers outside developed countries, particularly in a LAC sample. We have shown that this difference seems to be driven by this higher share of hand-to-mouth people living in LAC. Two thoughts there. It's not something to celebrate, right? I mean, the fact that the multiplier is larger, sometimes you say, oh, great, it's larger. No, this is not something to be happy about, because if the mechanism is coming through the arguments I just discussed, then it means that the multiplier is larger because we are financially constrained. That's not good. But in any case, it's high, and sometimes when dealing with short-term policies, it's a good strategy. And more importantly, even though it might seem social transfers as a reasonable tool to deal with the cycle, because precisely one would suspect that in recessions, the share of hand-to-mouth people increases, is not a very good fiscal tool to promote long-term growth, as Isaac was discussing, as I was showing you with another paper on public investment. So happy on the front of the results, be careful on the policy front. With that, I end, and here you have this little guy looking for money. And the reason why this guy is wearing a tie is because sometimes we tend to think about hand-to-mouth people as being poor, as sometimes I tend to say, but they're not necessarily poor people. They might be just middle class, financially constrained. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guillermo. I think we all prepared presentation for 20 minutes, so we're ahead of time. So we have about 9 minutes for open discussion. So just jump in.
Can I ask a question? Hi, everybody. Hi, Isaac, Guillermo, Ernesto. So I have two questions, basically. One, the whole model is like for a closed economy, but from my experience, when I did multipliers for some countries, not social transfers, even though the action may come from consumption, there is a lot going on in imports as well. So that increasing consumption is not non-tradable consumption, it's imports. So I guess that dynamics can be quite different. In the empirical front, you can measure that by looking at what is the response of imports. And then in the model, you can open up the economy and see if there is some general equilibrium channel that is non-trivial there. And then the other issue is like, I always wonder with this empirical methodology, if you can truly isolate the shock to the particular expenditure that you're looking, social transfer in this case, because in many of these countries, the size of the government has increased a lot, not just individually social transfers. So it's like we have trends. And I know that you include like past values of Xi in general, but in a given month, it could be, or quarter, it could be that transfers are increasing, but all the other ones are increasing as well. So in a sense, there might be like a common shock to all type of expenditures, and then a specific shock, idiosyncratic if you want, to transfer. So it's not obvious to me how to disentangle these two, but I want to put it on the table just in case you ever thought about this and could be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Some other question? Someone else?
I think that they have another question. Have you estimate the impact on employment for those transfers? Because especially in the US, I know that they now have a problem with there are more employments, the disposable employments than people on unemployment. So I think that could be a great, I don't know, like a plus for your work.
Thank you. We're good? Okay, so thank you so much, Javier. Thank you so much, Isaac. Great points. I fully agree, Javier. Great to see you on the openness front. On the empirics, we should be able to test this. On the theoretical, we should be able to try it. I know that, and there are more theory people that know much more than me here, that when you start doing that type of things, results could change a lot. But I don't remember us doing that, so it's great to test that. On the empirical front, yeah, I mean, that's why I like more taxes, because on taxes, we can identify things, this reform, or if you go in spending, you can do the type of work of identifying a particular spending reform, but it's very, very tough. So what we try to do is what people do, and I agree with you, Javier, with lots of potential problems. And if I fully agree with your comment, we try to do some lags and try to do some things that people typically do. And if you put your point, even at a larger perspective, this also relates to taxes, right? We always do this in a very partial equilibrium, right? We do this, we solve this, and then we move to this other spending, and we do this, and we never do this truly in an integrated framework. So I fully agree with your point conceptually. I would hope that if we took out already the unemployment insurance front, and we mostly got with the long-term social structural transfers, family programs, and so on and so forth, and the pensions, hopefully that large variation will not be an issue, but it's more of an assumption than a true answer. So I share your sentiment on that. And Isaac, I fully agree with you. This relates to some of other work that we are doing. A typical critique to the social transfers is that they might reduce the incentives to work. And more importantly, I find it very puzzling when people say this. It's not that it does increase inequality, informality, but once you get in, you don't get out. So once you receive that social transfer, because you lose your job and you became informal, it's much larger in the next boom to become part of a formal job because you already have it. And that's part of what I think the Argentinian government is trying to do with some of the reforms that they're pushing for, trying to solve that front. So I fully agree. And in the case of LAC, I would add to the labor front, the informality front. Again, I think that at least on the social and on the pension front, that will not be an issue because these are pension people. But even if we have the ability to split that, it would be great to test that different mechanism because one would hope that on the pension front, it wouldn't affect much employment, but probably on the family programs, it might affect. So that's a great point and something to work on. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody.
So one more question, this is Ernesto. Of course, the paper that doesn't talk about that, but this is a paper about COVID. I mean, it's so topical nowadays. Yeah. And taking what Javier said, in the sense of many things going on at the same time, so probably it's difficult to identify. What kind of things can you think you can say about the COVID crisis and all that? For instance, this point about the construction of labor supply, this is something that we're seeing everywhere. We don't know why, but one possible candidate is government transfers, or you may think that the multipliers is particularly large right now, or some other aspect, at least of the model, has to do with what is implicit in the results is that the accommodation of monetary policy is stronger in countries where the share of hand-to-mouth consumers is larger. Well, the degree of accommodativeness of monetary policy varies across countries in the current crisis. So is there anything you feel you can say about it?
Yeah, Ernesto, actually we finished this first paper, and the second paper we finished now is, I think that precisely because of, as you said, and Javier said, Isaac, especially during COVID, if Javier has a point, he truly has a point in COVID because everything was touched, right? Countries became more accommodative. Now they are regretting that. Now they're having some troubles. Not regretting, but because the past is the past, but they're having some troubles. They did everything. They throw everybody in every direction to try to shoot for a solution. So what we did was to exploit our results, which are in a framework of tranquil times, and apply calibrating to COVID. Calibrated in the sense of, first one would suspect, as you said, that the monetary policy was more accommodative during COVID, so that would increase the size of the multiplier. Second, the targeting, especially in some countries, was very good. When you take a look at the ability of some of the emergency funds to reach the poor, which are the most hand-to-mouth people, it was very high. So what we did in the second paper is exactly that, is to try to integrate household surveys, these results coming from this database, and try to come with an educated guess of how high the multipliers were. And actually they were quite higher, and going to Isaac's points on below or bigger than 1, they were quite larger than 1. The case of Argentina was quite larger. The case of other, if you think through the eyes of the United States, the ability to target was not that high, right? Because we all got transfers. So those kind of discussions are the ones that we emphasize in the second paper, the ability to target with those transfers much more than the higher share of hand-to-mouth, which is an embedded result coming from paper 1. So I fully agree with that. We are finishing that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now it's going to be my turn. Isaac, could you give me the time, please? let me know 5 minutes before the end.
Okay. 5 minutes.
Then this is, I have it open, but I cannot see it in the. Okay, let's do this. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
There we go. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming today. I am Ernesto Pasten and work at the Central Bank of Chile. This is John Work with a bunch of guys, with Lydia Cox, who is a Harvard student now on the market, Gernot Miller, who work in Tübingen, Rafael Charle, who's in transition between the Cleveland Fed and Brandeis, and Michael Berber, who is at Chicago Booth. And the name of the paper is Big G. You'll get very quickly why we call it that way. So let me start just fixing ideas. This is a 5-facts paper. It's kind of a class of papers that is being emerging in different topics. This is just one of those specific to Big G. So what is that we call Big G? Is what we do is that we study the anatomy of Big G and try to suggest that the exact way that Big G is constructed is it has some micro implications. So what we call Big G? Big G, basically we call it the purchases of the government of goods and services. Typically in models, we call that capital G, so Big G, and we typically model it just as a chunk of GDP. So if you want to take one message from today's talk is that it is not a chunk of GDP. It's way more complicated than that. And we're going to use our 5 facts that I'm going to show you in a second to discipline G-shocks in a new Keynesian model. And it's going to do 2 things. It may help to rationalize why inflation tend not to respond to G-shocks, which is something that we observed, and I mean, it's been documented in the data. And there are going to be large heterogeneity of the fiscal multiplier coming from G-shock, depending on exactly which sectors they hit. And that's something that hopefully also you're going to take out of this talk. So what is the main contribution of this paper? And the way I see it is that in the best of our knowledge, this is the first systematic exploration of the microanatomy of non-defense federal government purchases of goods and services. We also do defense, state, and local, but some people already work with defense, and this is so we go even more detail in defense, but non-defense is really the part that is new. And something important that's going to come up is going to be a corollary of this paper is that if there is large heterogeneity in the fiscal multiplier of these shocks, depending on which sector and which firms is hitting, that means that also going to be large heterogeneity in the sub-multiplier, whether we're hitting defense or non-defense, or even state or local. So even if we may have a common empirical strategy is to use defense expenditure, assuming that those are more exogenous than non-defense, that is probably correct. But that doesn't mean that those multipliers are going to be really informative to the typical fiscal multiplier, if we think that the typical fiscal multiplier are going to be those that are basically follow the patterns of government spending and the type of sectors or the particular the particular characteristics of government spending. So talking about the microanatomy of the government spending, or let's say government purchases of goods and services, that is the way that I should call it, they're going to be these 5 facts. Fact 1 is that it's granular. It's highly concentrated in few firms or in few sectors. The second one is that it's sectorally biased. The typical basket of government spending is very, very different from the typical basket of households or let's say private agents. The third one is they're going to be moderate, low persistence, much lower than typical macro estimates. I'm going to get back to that in later on when I'm going to show you more details about it. The fourth one is that there is a big chunk of the variation in government spending is really idiosyncratic, meaning that there is a small common component. So it's not that the government basically decides to spend G, it's just that decide to spend G in some particular sector, in some particular type of goods and services, and that varies a lot from time to time. The fifth one is that government spending is highly biased, as I said before, but it's especially biased to sectors which prices are typically sticky. By that, I don't mean that are sticky to government purchases, are sticky in general for any sort of purchases, private or public. And that is where most of the action in the government in the model is going to come from, although we need all 5 facts in order to get the action going, as I will show you later. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to show you a little bit about the data, then I'm going to briefly motivate the 5 facts, and then I'm going to go to the model. And I'm going to skip the literature review as usual in short talks. So what is that data description? What we do, we take the universe of government procurement data from a website, which the data is actually public, is usaspending.gov. This data has been put together by Congress in the US in an attempt to make government spending on government purchases of goods and services more transparent to the general public. So this is the universe of US federal contracts between 2001 and 2018. And actually, not only not only federal, also there's data on state and local level. 54% of contracts are defense, which are about 2/3 of the value, but still we have a big chunk of contracts that are not really in the defense category. In total, we have 57 million observations, 160,000 recipient firms distributed in about 1,200 6-digit NAICS codes, NAICS industry codes. So it's very, very rich data. In the contract, so we have the characteristics of each contract. We have the award with a specific origin, which is the government agency, which is actually buying the goods or hiring the services. And we have the recipient firm. We also have the records, we have the amount involved in the contract, the date of the contract, the date and the characteristics of the modification of the contract, and the type of contract. In particular, we're going to have 2 types of contracts. Type of contract 1 is basically the government auction a given activity or the purchases of given goods. Then firms basically do their bidding and then choose the most convenient one, typically the one with the cheapest price, but not necessarily. It could be some other characteristic about quality or other stuff that they care about. And that is basically has a fixed price. That is the price for the full provision of the goods and services, and that's it. An alternative type of contract is a contract where the government also auction a given activity, but instead of bidding on prices, the different companies give some, they do their proposals, the government chooses one, and then the government commits to pay a given markup above all the cost experienced by the firm on the pursuing of the project. Typically, that's done for bigger projects. For instance, if the governments want to build a new submarine, they're not going to auction across all possible firms, even if there might be a little bit by the French and the US recently. But they're basically going to hire a given company, and then the company is going to document all the costs that it has incurred in order to develop the submarine, and the government is going to pay a fixed markup above that. And all of the companies are going to compete in terms of the project, but also in terms of how large the markup is going to be. We're going to merge this data set with BLS microdata on producer prices sorted at 6-digit NAICS codes. We have about 100,000 observations. Why? Because we want to make this point that government spending is going to be more biased to those sectors that have more sticky prices. And for that, we need prices beyond the prices that are implicit on the contracts. We need a private transaction prices, and this is where it comes from. Also, we're going to complement this data with state and local spending for 341 6-digit net codes coming from our previous work on productive networks, using the BEA input-output networks, input-output tables from the US. So this is basically what making the distinction between the government purchases and the total government spending. What we really have in mind when we call big G is the government consumption of expenditures plus gross investment. And that basically can get divided in two categories. Federal, about 40%, and state and local, which is about 60%. For federal, we can divide it also on consumption expenditure, 77%, and gross investment. And about consumption expenditure, that is really, we can divide it between value added and the purchases of intermediate goods and services. This is the part that we have with our data. Also, from the gross investment, we can divide it in R&D, or we can divide it in structural equipment and software. And this is also a part that we can observe in on data. Value added can get split between consumption of fixed capital and compensation to employees. This is something we're not going to be able to observe in our data. So bottom line, government contracts are going to be about 16% of the total of big G of government spending. And if we add state and local, we're going to get about 75% of what is big G. Now, just to give you a hint of how our data behaves, this is in dashed line, you see basically the same type of expenditure taken from national accounting. And bottom line is that for total, defense, and non-defense, in our sample, they look very similar to our data. So let's start with the 5 facts. Fact 1 is granularity, meaning that the government spending is highly concentrated in few firms or in few sectors. If you will look at the firm dimension, which is the figure at the left, you're going to see that for the top 10 firms, they already capture or take about 35, like a third of the total of government purchases of goods and services. If we take the top 0.1%, is a little bit more than 40, about 50%. If we go to the top 1%, it's about the 80%, and we take the top 10% of firms, they basically take it all. So you see that there is a high concentration of few firms or sectors. Few firms, sorry. Now looking at the sectoral level, basically the same thing, but at 6 digits industries, we observe that for the top 5 sectors, we also get about 1/3. For the top 1% of the sectors, it's about 40–50%, and for the top 10% of sectors goes about 0.9. So again, high concentration. If we look at the 2 digits industries, it's basically the same picture. Now, another way to look at granularity is looking at the distribution of the log of firms' obligations, so meaning those contracts signed by firms in which they're obligated to provide to the government the goods and services specified in the contract. And this is the fraction of the total expenditure or the total of log obligations across different firms. And basically the bottom line, this is about firms, this is about transactional value. In both cases, you're going to see that the distribution looks very much like a Pareto pattern, in the sense of that a regression of the log obligations to the log fraction is basically it's a log linear relationship, which is, according to Gabet, is one way to say that there is a fat tail an upper fat tail in the distribution of firms' obligations, that we can interpret it as granularity, in the sense that the government expenditure is highly concentrated on those disproportionately large firms in terms of their share of the total of government purchases of goods and services. Exactly the same thing, probably a little bit less, but exactly the same thing happens on the transactional value level. Now, fact 2 is about sectoral bias. So here we want to motivate that the typical basket of government spending is very, very different from what private agents' typical basket of purchases of goods and services. And that is going to be true at the federal level, state level, and local level, and also is going to be true when we split the federal level between defense and non-defense. So on the x-axis, we have the GDP shares, which is basically the share of each 6 digits sector in GDP, which accounts for their share in the total real expenditure of all type of agents in the economy, both public and non-public. And on the y-axis, we have the government spending shares according to the data that we have. So if the typical basket of government expenditure and private expenditure should be about the same, we should see all dots aligned in the 45-degree line. They are not. They are not for state and local, which are the blue dots or the blue squares with a cross, and the federal one, which are the red dots. If we do exactly the same thing for defense and non-defense, again, it's all over the place. For defense, which are the blue stars, and for non-defense, which are the green triangles. This is another way of looking exactly the same thing. This is basically a 2 digits, and we rank the sectors according to the importance in the federal purchases of goods and services. The most important is manufacturing, taking about 30% of the total purchases of goods and services by the government in or sample, and they account only for 12% in the in GDP. Professional, scientific, and technical services is a little bit less than 30% for federal, about 15% for state, and only 4% for GDP. Administrative and waste management is about 9%, 11% for state and local, as you can imagine, and only 1.1% for GDP. I suppose if we look at healthcare and social assistance, it's 12% for GDP, but only 1.27% for federal and 0.84% for state. So again, bottom line message, the typical basket of goods purchased by the government, and any definition of government you may like, is very different from what private agents are typically buying. Fact 3 is moderate persistence. This is going to be true at 3 levels: contract level, firm level, sector, and it's also going to be true for defense and non-defense. The first thing that we have to say is that at the transactional level, about 90% of contracts are what is called single transaction purchases, such that the median duration of a contract of the US government at any level with a firm, with a typical firm in the economy, is only 31 days. That means that, I don't know, Guillermo is sitting in the World Bank, in the printer next to his office, there is always paper. If that will be a government agency, the government, in average, they're buying different paper every month from a different supplier. And that is typically, I mean, I don't know exactly for the printer, but this is going to be the typical type of purchases that the government makes. So even if the government tends to buy similar stuff through time, they tend to buy it to different suppliers, and the turnover of the suppliers tend to be high. The median duration is 123 days. So you see that there is a lot of skewness of the distribution of duration to very few firms, which are probably the largest, and also the one that are running these big projects, basically building the supermarket for building the submarines for the Marines. But still, the duration of a contract is relatively low. Something else that we do is that we compute government spending at the two-digit sectors for the top 3 two-digit sectors according to the importance in government purchases of goods and services, and simply compute an AR1 process of log of those purchases. And we find that the AR1 coefficient is 0.45 for the top 3 and 0.37 for all of other sectors. So again, that even at the contract level, at the firm level, and at the sectoral level, there is relatively low persistence. This is another way of looking at exactly the same thing. So, okay, so there is the zoom bar here, so I cannot see it very much, but I'm gonna do my best. Here are the number of years in the data set that we have for firms. And for all firms, and this is the share of firms, so this is basically an ugly histogram of firms according to how many years they show up in our data set. And for all firms, we observe that almost 50% of all firms are observable in our data set only for 1 year. That means that they won one procurement contract for 1 year and never really won a procurement contract again. For the top 0.1% is a little bit below than 30%. For the top 10 or the top 1% is about 20%. And you see that there is a big decrease of, so the number of firms really remaining in a data set, or meaning winning a procurement contract more than once in almost 20 years, goes down very quickly, up to, of course, we get to the very end where we have very few firms that are really in our sample all the time, because basically are the ones that justify these big projects that probably last forever. Fact 4 is about idiosyncratic variation dominates in the data. And this is again true for defense and non-defense. So the first thing that we do is that we estimate an AR1 process and model frequency at the sectoral level, and we add time fixed effects, and we observe that the R² raises when we have the fixed effect to 98.34%, and when we take out the fixed effect, is 97.94%. We interpret this as evidence that the common component across the different processes for the different sectors is really explaining as tiny variation, tiny share of the variation in the data. We also do some exercise in the spirit of Gabel granular paper, in which we construct residuals, taking only those sectors at 6 digits that are the bigger one, and we compute the average for basically this is at the firm level, actually, not at the sector level. So I said it wrong. In a way that if really there is a lot of idiosyncratic variation, what we should observe is that this granular residual should explain a big chunk of the total variation of government spending, which is exactly what we find. So it's highly significant, and its parameters is very close to 1, and that is going to be true when we do it for firms and when we do it for 6-digit sectors. So again, there is a lot of idiosyncratic variation, which is consistent with our previous result about persistence. It's really firms are moving, a lot of firms are exiting and entering to the data set, meaning that firms, a lot of new firms get procurement contracts. Then it's natural to think that that government purchases basically there is a high turnover of firms, meaning that there is a lot of idiosyncratic variation. Also, something else that this is saying is that it's not that the government decides, if the government decides to expand, let's say, expenditure, it's not expanding expenditure uniformly across all different sectors. It does it for some particular purposes. And when you think about it, it's pretty natural, but it's not the way that we tend to think about it in models. The final fact, how I'm doing with time, Isaac?
Yeah, you have 5 minutes and a half.
Okay, thank you so much. Hopefully, we're gonna be able to get there. So the fact 5 is that purchases tend to be tilted to sticky price sectors. So this is a figure of 2 digits, where on the y-axis we had the frequency of price changes of all the sectors measured according to the micro data underlying the PPI in the US. And on the y-axis, we have the importance of sectors in for the, I cannot see it, but sorry, I think it's for the government. Let me do this 1 sec. Never mind. So basically, the big dots are the sector that are really important for the government, and you see that they tend to be quite sticky. So we're not talking here about the stickiness of government contracts, which is natural because, as I said before, a big chunk of contracts really define the price at the beginning of the service and then keep the same price constant over time. So this has to be justified by the degree of stickiness of other type of contracts. If you're still worried that this level of stickiness is driven by the fixed price nature of government contracts, basically what we do is that since we have the duration of the contract, we can compute the average duration for each sector, and we can compute the implicit frequency of price changes that those duration imply, and are basically the same result, which means that it cannot be that the degree of stickiness of those sectors is driven only by these government contracts. So now I'm going to jump to the model. I'm not going to show you the details of the model. I'm just going to say that basically what we do is that we build a Mickey Mouse textbook type of models with only 2 sectors, where one sector is meant to be the sectors where private consumption or private purchases of goods and services, to say it more precisely, are concentrated, and another sector in which the government purchases of goods and services are more concentrated. And we're going to calibrate those 2 sectors in a way consistent with our 5 facts, and we're going to show you how different the fiscal multiplier is going to be on those 2 sectors. So first, they're going to be representative households, which decides consumption and the sectoral segmented labor. Consumption is going to be cost diverse across sectors. They're going to be a series aggregator within each sector. They're going to be as a standard monopolistic competitive firms with caliber pricing, alpha 1 for sector 1 and alpha 2 for sector 2. Just to keep it simple, because we solved the model in closed form and we have a bunch of propositions in the paper. A monetary policy is targets. It has a strict inflation targeting, so prices keep constant all the time. Government purchases are financed by lump sum taxes because we don't want to have action on that front. The weight of sector 1 in government purchases is going to be called gamma. The steady state weight of sector 1 on consumption is going to be omega, and the steady state weight of consumption on output is going to be psi, such that we can compute implicitly the psi of sector 1 relative to sector 2. So the granularity, we're going to account for granularity in the model, assuming that sector 2 is going to be the one that is going to concentrate most of the government purchases on the top 3 2-digit industries, such that 1 minus lambda is going to be equal to, 1 minus gamma is going to be 0.7. Sectoral, thank you. The sectoral bias is going to be consumption tilde to sector 1, so omega is going to be 0.95. The moderate persistent, we're going to assume that sector 1 shocks, government shocks are going to have a persistence of 0.37. In sector 2, the one where government is more concentrated, it's 0.45. They're going to be idiosyncratic variation. So that means that when there is going to be a shock, it's going to be a sector-specific shock. And government is going to be more tilted to sticky sectors in the sense that carbon parameters for sector 1 is going to be 0.78, and for sector 2 is going to be 0.89. And this is basically the main picture. I don't have time to show you the details. Basically, we split the effect of the multiplier in sector 1 and sector 2 according to adding one by one all of the 5 facts. And bottom line is that the blue line is the multiplier that you get in this model if the 2 sectors are perfectly symmetrical. The red dot line is the one that you're going to get when we account for the 5 facts, and you see that there is a big difference in the size of the multiplier. Actually, in some cases, the multiplier can get even larger than 1, as we show in the paper, and I don't have time to show you here. So main takeaways, there is no fiscal shock. Actually, there is not even a government purchases shock. Lowering stickiness in sector 1 increases the multiplier of sector 2. This is something that was in the figures that I showed you. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to show you that. Heterogeneity increases, heterogeneity in the fiscal multipliers consistent with the evidence, and broadly consistent with the evidence of leading inflationary effect of fiscal shock. And the reason why we're giving you this is because the typical shock, if we follow the typical structure of government purchases of goods and services, is going to be more tilted to sectors that have highly sticky prices, therefore not so much inflationary pressure and not so much reason for monetary policy to respond and crowd out private purchases. And that's all. Well, basically the same thing that I said. I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Question?
Do you guys see my slides or not?
Yes.
Okay, this is.
I did on the top center, stop sharing.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Some question. Excellent work. Tons of work. Fantastic. Congrats. I have a couple of thoughts. When you were going through all the, I couldn't avoid the temptation to think about benchmarking these results and look through the eyes of how to interpret those results. It seems to me an interpretation is that, as you said, for the big firms that are, well, I don't know if they are the big firms, but for the firms that are the largest providers of the government, they seem to be on a quite constant relationship. They tend to provide, probably because they provide some specific type of goods that are difficult to provide somewhere else. But for the rest of the goods, which are many firms, there seems to be, as you show, moderate persistence. And when thinking through those eyes, I was thinking how to push your finding through the eyes of efficiency of spending, of somehow the ability to pull every time from a different pool of suppliers. If I had to think about our countries, I would have the sense that this might not be the case even for a tomato can, because we trust so much that tomato can that we cannot avoid buying it, or maybe because there is something else. So I was wondering if you know, if there is something about the way in which the local and federal government purchase goods that could help you disentangle a little bit of that. Maybe, I don't know, the federal government is able to reach to a larger pool of suppliers. The local governments, I don't know if they have that opportunity or not. So if there is some sense in which even within your sample, you can exploit how informational abilities to reach more of a national suppliers could give you a sense of how important it is having access to a national broad-based supply of suppliers. If you have a sense of that, because that is, I mean, some of the procurement changes that I'm aware that some of our countries are doing are in that direction to make things more accessible on top of the transparency that they just showed. So I wonder if you have something that even within the US you can exploit to say, if you have some access, more access, you could be more efficient, at least through the lenses of these main facts that you show us that are so nice.
Humberto?
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very good work. I really like. I have just a question about your first result about like the granularity. So here there is like a contractor, and then there might be subcontractor. So it might be this contract actually go to very few firms, but then they were this few firms reallocate the contract to like a tons of different firms. Can you say something about this like a type of supplier, like buyer type of relationship?
Thank you. Javier?
Really nice work. I have like a comment and a question, or maybe two comments. So in the empirical part, I think it would be nice to have an exercise to say, if I take like the brute force typical approach to identify a government expenditure shock, I obtain this response, say in GDP. But then by looking at all this heterogeneity, and maybe with the help of the model, you can try to address where are the biases that I'm committing, what are the problems that I have in a quantitative way. You show these 5 facts should tend to put warning signs on the aggregate estimations, but in relative terms, compared to what I actually observed, these correlations of the multipliers in the type of exercise that Guillermo did, how are they decomposed? I think that would be a nice exercise. And then the other one is more conceptual, and when you talk about inflation, and I understand the fact that if the government is buying goods from firms that has sticky prices, that's one of the channel, that's the direct channel. But then in general equilibrium is like these firms are paying more wages or hiring more people, and that fits into general equilibrium, and that's the other part of propagation and potential inflation. Your presentation was kind of short in terms of the model, so I wasn't able to see. Of course, you didn't present it, so it's not a problem. But I wonder whether you have exploited that, because for me, it's not just a sufficient statistic to say that the firm that is receiving the money from the government has low or is really sticky. I shouldn't care about inflation. General equilibrium might be important as well.
Thanks. Anyone else? No? Okay. So thank you very much for all the comments. And those comments give me the perfect excuse to tell you about the other papers, the other projects that are being following up this one. So about the efficiency of spending, this is exactly what we're doing now. Actually, I'm overdue with my part of that project to my co-authors now. And basically, the bottom line there is that if we believe that government spending multipliers is heterogeneous depending on which sectors firms are buying, or what are the characteristics of the contracts, or what are the type of firms that can apply, or stuff like that, then that naturally means that we can think about a design of the procurement procedure in order to optimize it according to some goal. It could be employment, it could be maximize the fiscal multiplier, it could be welfare, it could be probability of being re-elected, as you name it. And this is actually something that we're doing right now in a different paper. Basically, the bottom line there is that there's going to be an optimal basket from the social perspective. And then the central government, a benevolent government, may like to deviate from that. And the main reason, and this is only one reason why the government may deviate with that. I agree with you, with Guillermo, that probably there could be many. But taking this literature on granularity, that literature says that business cycles are driven by idiosyncratic shocks as opposed to aggregate shocks. That make a big challenge to the standard macro policy that we tend to think, which are basically hitting the whole economy or Probably we could argue that monetary policy doesn't hit the whole economy uniformly, but this is basically the way that we typically model it. And that creates a tension because the shock and therefore the inefficiency is happening at the idiosyncratic level, at the disaggregated level, and the policy tool we have is at the aggregate level. But well, government spending can give you a tool also at this aggregate level. So it may be in that particular context even better to manage business cycles if business cycle, the monetary policy, if business cycle have an idiosyncratic origin as opposed to an aggregate origin. The same type of thinking, we could expand that if we want to maximize employment or we want to maximize the fiscal multiplier. It's going to be that the government in certain situations will want to deviate from, let's say, the optimal basket of government purchases of goods and services to something else in order when there's going to be some trade-off with some other goals that may have. So not as general as you may like, but this is exactly what we are doing right now. Talking about the contracting, that's excellent point. And this also allow me to say something about some other project that I am working with a number of co-authors, which is for the US, we have data limitations. We only have the name of the firm who got awarded the contract. We don't have the input output, let's say, of that firm. So we cannot know what is going on, how that firm really satisfy this extra demand that is getting from the government. And also we don't know, and this goes a little bit to one of Javier's questions about identification. Well, here we just tell you that government spends in some given way. We cannot tell you whether that shock really follows that pattern. And unfortunately, I only say that government spending in defense could be a valid identification strategy, but it's not going to be very informative for the typical government shock. But I'm not giving you any alternative. So something else that we are doing is that we're exploring Chilean data where we have many different attractive features. Feature one is that we have the universe of procurement auctions, not contracts in addition, but also we have the auction. So we have the identity of all firms that actually are bidding for that particular auction. And we have the tax reports of those firms, and we have the input-output relationship of those firms coming from the VAT claims of those firms. So basically, we can have a very good picture of what those firms are doing. And then I can give Javier some identification strategy because we can compare the winning of a contract with those that are the closest twins. We're never exactly the same, but basically we're doing an identification strategy there. And we have tons of variables that we can look at. So answering specifically Humberto's question, on the first year in the Chilean data that a firm gets one procurement contract, employment doesn't react. Capital doesn't react. Intermediate inputs react strongly. Now that could be because the type of goods that these firms are selling to the government, are different from the typical firm that the firm produces. One other possibility, it could be outsourcing. So that really satisfy this extra demand, basically hiring some other firms to do what they have been hired to do. And year one, after the procurement contract, we see that salaries start to go up and the number of workers start to go up, and a little bit increase in investment, but we see the most of the increase in investment in year two. Something that we're doing now, which is related to Guillermo's question, is that we also are able to split the data, not so much because then we lose a lot of power in the estimation, and then basically we can say nothing, but we can split the contracts in terms of, we can define few sectors. Basically we do construction, services, and manufacturing. And we also can split these biddings into these auctions in terms of the amount involved and also in terms of the duration that is implicit in the contract, because we have all the characteristics of the contract being auctioned with the data. And this is also the dimension that we're looking at in order to think about how really is the transmission mechanism going on for those particular type of contracts for government purchases, and also trying to think about what are the biggest gains in terms of the government in the design of the procurement procedure in order to take the best advantage of those. The last thing about wages, I completely agree with Javier talked about bias, and I said that with the work we've done so far, we cannot identify shocks, government shocks. We could say little about that empirically. We could say about that a little bit with our estimate using this procurement data, but then we do different estimations. This is the only type of exercise we can do. So by design, we net out the general equilibrium effects. So part of that project is to build a model and try to bring in the general equilibrium effects through the lens of a model that matches the type of behavior that we see in the firms getting the procurement contracts. And then the only assumption that we're making there is that there could be some general equilibrium effects, but the firms that are going to react the most are those firms that actually get one of these contracts. And if you believe that assumption, then our identification strategy and our approach go through. So I don't know whether there is any more discussion, but I'm happy to stay a little bit longer if we don't get kicked out.
One last thing that I thought super nice. You have tons of work to do. Super nice. But I was thinking, in terms of the multipliers, one of the things that you might be facing, especially, and I'm speculating here, with a country like the United States that is so predictable, I guess, in their purchases, right? They would buy this and this every time, and so on and so forth, as opposed to our countries that are more interesting in terms of how we buy things. If that is the case, then there might be a lot of anticipation, right? There might be a lot of, well, especially for those big firms, I might be able to say, well, 6 months from now, they're going to ask me this, 6 months from now, they're going to ask me this. So this typical identification that you would need in terms of being an unanticipated shock might be a little bit tough, I guess, on some particular type of spending. But so I'm not so sure, again, how much of that data will be able to use as a shock. But in terms of the efficiency discussion, in terms of the design of procurement, in terms of information, in terms of competition, all that part, I think the ability to expand is fantastic. Again, a thought.
I agree with that. And again, this with the US, we can say little about that because of data limitation. With Chilean data, we can say much more. But even something I want to remark is that it's true that big firms behave a little bit different than the typical firm, let's say, in the US, but still the 5 facts are valid for those, in the sense of, for instance, think about what's happening in the news with the Australia deal of submarines and the clash between France and the US. Probably in the US, there is 1 or 2 producers of submarines, but around the globe, there are more. And then can still contract from one to another. So even if there is still a lot of variation in government purchases, even for these big firms, even if they remain always in our data set. And on the top of that, something that we cannot, we can check that if we want to go deeper on that, is that we do know the type of the goods that they're buying. So suppose that you are Boeing. You always sell stuff to the Department of Defense, but you not always sell the same stuff to the Department of Defense. And that may still make a difference.
Fair enough.
Okay, so shall we call it a day?
All right.
Okay, so thank you very much, Isaac.
Thank you very much.
Guillermo and everyone who come to the session, and let's keep enjoying the La Silla Lames conference.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.